everyone. Good afternoon to Asia, good evening to the Pacific, and good morning to Europe. I'd like to welcome all of you to the APRU Multi-Hazards webinar series, Reimagining Humanitarian Architecture for the Future in a Complex Era. This webinar series is organized by the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, APRU Multi-Hazards Program, and the International Research Institute of Disaster Science, IRIDIS, Tohoku University in Japan. I'm Takako Izumi, Associate Professor of Tohoku University and Program Director of the APRU Multi-Hazards Program. APRU is a network of more than 60 universities in the Pacific Rim from 19 economies, and its international secretariat is based in Hong Kong. Tohoku University hosts the secretariat of the APRU Multi-Hazards Program. So please check the APRU website for further information on the network and also a Multi-Hazards Program. Under the COVID-19 pandemic, many countries were affected by natural hazards in 2020. The combination of the pandemic and natural hazards led to serious challenges, including financial losses and psychosocial stresses. Additionally, COVID-19 greatly influenced people's decision to evacuate regardless of their hazard types on a country. Given the situation that our future risks will be complex and diverse, it is crucial to strengthen our response capacity towards various hazards. One of the challenges is how to deliver necessary assistance to an affected country under a pandemic. How should we enhance our current disaster management capacity that can be applied for various or all hazards? And how should we reshape and scale up our current capacity? I hope we can find some hints to these questions at today's discussion. I'm very much excited to introduce the speakers for today. The first and second speakers, Mr. Oliver Lacey-Hall and Ms. Jessica Alexander, have significant experiences, especially in disaster response all over the world. Professor Miwa Hirono has long and significant career in research, and recently, I understand that she is focusing on disaster response at local and community levels. While you're listening to the presentations, I would like to encourage you to send us questions using the Q&A function. After each presentation, we will have a Q&A session to answer those questions. So now I'd like to introduce and welcome the first speaker, Mr. Oliver Lacey-Hall, Lead Advisor for the Australia-Indonesia Partnership on Disaster Risk Management, CIAP-SIAGA program, with a focus on supporting improved disaster management in the Asia and Pacific regions. And in addition, his current role includes practitioner partner with the University of Virginia's Humanitarian Collaborative working on early childhood development in emergencies, and senior advisor on communications and partnerships for the Sunway Center for Planetary Health at Sunway University, Malaysia. He had significant experiences in various organizations such as such as director at the UK's Humanitarian and Stabilization Operations Team, UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA in Indonesia, New York, and led various missions for disaster and crisis responses in many countries. And he's also served as different UN agencies like UNHCR, UNDP, EU's Humanitarian Office, and UK government, and OSCE. Oliver holds a master's degree in gender analysis and development from the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom. So thank you, Oliver, for joining us today. And we are very lucky and honored to have you today at the session and learn from your vast experience. So the floor is yours.
Takako, thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be here. I'm now going to try and grapple with the technology and launch my PowerPoint presentation. That's immediately gone wrong. Share screen. Here we go. Share. Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today at this really interesting and important event. As you said, one of my current roles is working as the lead advisor for the regional element of a program called Siap Siaga, which in Indonesian basically means be ready. And that part of the program, which is funded by the Australian government, supports cooperation and collaboration between Australia and Indonesia in enhancing, supporting regional disaster management and humanitarian action. And I'm going to today just share a little bit of information with you about some work that we have been doing over the last 9 months, led by the two governments and supported by us, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on disaster risk management in the Asia-Pacific region. And hopefully, that's going to help to reimagine, as you say, the humanitarian architecture for the future in this very complex era. But let me caveat my remarks by saying I'm not going to try and boil the ocean in the next 15-20 minutes, but just focus on some initial lessons that we've been working on. I guess some diagnosis of what we found will be useful and hopefully helpful to the discussions we're going to have today. So just a little bit, if I may, on the program, which is it's a 5-year program, as I said, funded by the government of Australia, really with sort of 2 key objectives. Firstly, to improve Indonesia's ability to prevent, to prepare for, respond to, and recover from rapid and slow onset disasters in Indonesia. And secondly, to strengthen cooperation between Australia and Indonesia on disaster risk management and humanitarian issues across the region. And I'm going to talk today about the work that we're doing in relation to the second objective. Sorry, very dense slide, which I will go through fairly quickly. So we're pretty much in the final stages of organizing this sort of lessons learned series of events in the lead up to the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is taking place in Bali in May of this year. We started off with basically recognizing that there was definitely some interesting stuff going on around the impact that COVID-19 was having on disaster risk management in very variable ways at kind of different levels of the disaster risk management and humanitarian systems. We were challenged, as we are today, with how do we start to look at this and think about this in the context of COVID-19, and we fell upon the idea, like everybody else has, of hosting some webinars. So we undertook 6 webinars looking at the various aspects of the interface, and I'll come back to that in a minute of COVID-19 on disaster management. We then progressed through some deeper analysis by 6 subject matter experts, which formed the basis for a regional symposium that we had at the end of October last year. And we're now finishing up the Global Lessons Learned report, really ready for a validation meeting in April. And hopefully, if we get the slot, at a side event at the GPDRR in May. And if not, then something which is adjunct to GPDRR. And we're focusing really on 3 objectives through this process. 1, contributing to enhancing national, regional, and global knowledge on disaster management. Secondly, trying to promote best practices and lessons that have emerged through this process during the COVID-19 pandemic. And thirdly, hopefully influencing our international and regional friends in adapting their policies and procedures for a post-pandemic world. So we're hoping, that this evidence base can provide, some thoughts for the region to reimagine humanitarian architecture so that it's fit for purpose. So the 6 webinars basically looked at these 6 issues. Here, a kind of initial broad discussion on how the pandemic has disrupted business as usual in disaster risk management across the region, and really focusing in that discussion primarily on response. And then a discussion on whether the pandemic changed the role of local organizations and whether that visible change was kind of desirable, sustainable, or was it simply a kind of blip, and we'll return to the old normal. We drilled down into local level adaptation strategies and tried to see whether local level resilience had been strengthened. We had a hard look at the impact of digital tech. And if you kind of look at how we're running this meeting today and how we've been running our lives for the last 2 years, I think we can all understand this incredible role that tech has played in the pandemic and the tremendous change it has wrought in how we meet, how we discuss issues, and how we interact with the people that we're trying to assist. We also asked the UN and ASEAN and the Humanitarian Advisory Group based in Australia about what adaptations they were undertaking, had undertaken, were planning to undertake. And finally, we looked at the role of the media in supporting messaging on disaster management in the context of the pandemic. And of course, we took a particularly close look at the role that social media was playing there. We had some pretty interesting people across the 6 webinars, many from the region. As you can see here, this was the first 3 webinars, colleagues from Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Oxfam, Plan International, the Prime Minister's office in Malaysia, of course, BNPB in Indonesia, and colleagues from the Philippines. And for the second 3, similarly, quite a number of interesting people, including colleagues from Facebook, from Twitter, the AHA Center, OCHA, and some of the kind of tech labs that are springing up in the region, like Pulse Lab Jakarta, a humanitarian data lab that operates out of Jakarta in Indonesia. So coming out of those 6 webinars, but really rich discussions. We had about 300 people participate across the 6 webinars. We had some really rich discussions, and I think what we found was that while the pandemic has caused huge devastation across the region, it certainly sort of provided space and opportunities to accelerate rapid transformation of disaster management and humanitarian action in order to kind of strengthen local leadership. But we found that there are 3 big pots of issues that remain highly problematic. And these were basically what we labeled as kind of, the big pots we labeled as governance and institutional partnership models, and of course, the increasingly significant role that digital tech and communication could be playing in the disaster management space. So let me drill down into those a little bit, to each of those a little bit. Sort of some really interesting stuff around, and I suppose I should caveat this by saying I'm not sure that we found anything particularly new, but we found different articulations of the same problems from different sets of interest groups. So for governance, this kind of systemic change that we all seem to want but don't seem to know how to quite reach remains a really sticky problem, and not really sufficiently driven, if you like, to allow, and yeah, I think I do mean the word allow, local actors to lead. There's also a limited willingness still to invest in local communities, local NGOs, local actors, despite the commitments that we saw coming out of the World Humanitarian Summit back in 2016. And in a certain way, it seemed like COVID-19 actually may have made this a bit worse, because the risk tolerance on the part of donors seemed to decrease as their access to how their money was being spent similarly decreased. And it seemed like larger proportions of resources were being pushed through the multilateral system, or being sent through the multilateral system. There were kind of 5 issues that we managed to boil this down to, really. Lack of incentives to change, and vested interests to maintain the status quo, a dependency largely on traditional ways of financing, traditional financing models, which don't seem to be changing as rapidly as the times seem to be changing, although there were some indications that's certainly on the radar screen of some of the big donors and organizations like OCHA. This kind of decreasing level of risk tolerance as a result of being less able to see what was going on, unfilled capacity gaps despite years of capacity development programming, and that's very much around what you conceptualize as capacity development, capacity building. What are you doing it for? Who are you doing it with? And regulatory frameworks that simply don't help change to happen. On partnership and sort of partnership models, this was kind of surprising. There doesn't seem to have been any kind of change in the way partnerships are constructed as a result of the pandemic. And certainly that's the message we were kind of getting from frontline local organizations. We all know that those frontline local actors are, they're the first responders. They're the ones who actually make things work. But their sense was that despite commitments to the contrary, they continue to be seen by the quote unquote big players in the system as contractees rather than true partners. So we're kind of seeing here, limited ambition, the application of success criteria that have little to do with partnership nurturing, some short-termism, a lack of commitment to sustained partnerships were all cited by the organizations that we spoke to as problems. And that wasn't limited only to national non-governmental organizations, but also regional and international to an extent. And so too was the often found inability to align interests given differing mandates, perspectives and goals. and interoperability was actually also a problem in many instances. For digital tech and communications, as I said, we can all see there's been a very significant leap forward, but its utilization hasn't actually led to a transformation of the business model yet. Digital capital remains largely untapped when compared with other sectors. Bits of the system are being digitized when pressured, like the very welcome insistence on disaggregated data, but there doesn't seem to be an overall plan. And I think, if you imagine if that was the case with global supply chain management, online cash transactions, air traffic control, and so on and so forth, it's maybe time to think and ask a little more clearly why the humanitarian system is lagging so badly. Humanitarian governance seems to have kept the tech sector at arm's length rather than inviting it in to help solve some of these very difficult issues around protection, data security, and so on and so forth. And then we have, of course, this instance of this situation with fake news, which has been enormously complicating, as is the focus on covering and reporting on the drama of response rather than effective communications on other elements of disaster risk management. So these issues were the subject of a regional symposium that we convened on the 27th of October. We commissioned 6 papers to help gather evidence during that symposium. We had about 400 people there who attended this event, which was entirely online. And the outcome of those discussions is now driving the compilation of a lessons learned document to help guide corrective actions that we hope can be taken in the region and by the region. So we're still finalizing the lessons learned document. I guess, here are a few areas which have emerged as important outcomes. I'm not going to read them out in the interest of time. None of them are new, as I said. But the point here, I think, is not about finding new stuff, but figuring out why the old stuff hasn't been fixed and perhaps trying to find ways to fix it. These 3 priorities, expediting localization, enhancing community resilience, and getting more savvy with digitech, are going to be the underpinnings of the report for sure, that we're aiming to present in May. I'd add here that it seems that the primary disconnect seems to be between what's happening on the ground, so to speak, and how regional international systems are reacting. Please feel free to read the symposium papers. They're rich with examples of local level adaptation. From Yakum in central Indonesia, where several sister organizations rapidly kind of merged into one powerful operational entity that helped local government to ensure that services got to vulnerable people during the pandemic and during disasters that took place during the pandemic. Plan International found that children, youth and adolescents were taking center stage in helping their communities navigate the rapid transition to online service provision. And we had local governments who really sort of worked in some instances much faster than their national counterparts to set up track and trace and statistical gathering to manage the spread of the disease. So finally, and this is probably my longest slide, in response to the request to provide some thoughts on reimagining the humanitarian system, here are 6 suggestions. As I said, none of them new, but seemingly somehow very stubbornly slow to move, especially it would seem at the international level. And the first 3 are pretty much 3 sides of the same coin, although I know a coin can only have 2 sides. I mean, firstly, there seems to be this sort of stubborn inability to think about capacity building beyond the benefit that it accrues for the partnership between the contractor and the contractee. The development system seems to do a great deal better at real kind of capacity building, looking at needs of communities and so on and so forth. So what's the problem here? I don't think I can answer that, but I can confirm that this came up repeatedly as a really significant issue during the process that we undertook. So it deserves some more thinking about and some more treatment. Secondly, and it's of course closely related to the first, as I've said, fostering resilience really needs to be at the root of how we engage with at-risk communities. I think this is going to become increasingly important as we look at a difficult future where resources are being stretched ever thinner. It also brings us back to discussions around the humanitarian development and peace building nexus, which I think, frankly, and from what we heard, are seen very much on the front line as things that are discussed in conference rooms in capitals and in headquarters rather than actually addressed sort of at the front line. Thirdly, and again, part of the same equation, I think, is rethink partnerships. We repeat this mantra that partnerships must empower. But the feedback is that while local organizations are pushing hard for change here, the big agencies are having a much more difficult time in accepting the need to decentralize. And that in this, the funders or donors seem to play a role that disincentivizes empowering partnerships, so that they're still really rather the exception rather than the rule. Fourthly, we've heard repeatedly how digital tech has been so important during the pandemic in order to share information about services, to understand needs, to empower disabled people to take action for themselves, to push back when things weren't going well, and to flag problems down the line. We also heard that those rendered most vulnerable were usually also those who had the greatest difficulty in accessing digitech. So maybe it's time to start rethinking what a humanitarian assistance package contains or is limited to. And I put some suggestions here in the slide as to some of the things we might want to think about there. Fifthly, really interesting, the tech providers who joined our discussions kind of made the point that partnering with humanitarian organizations is really difficult. Tech providers they're very influential, as we know, and yet they had the sense, and these were kind of their CSR colleagues and others who were talking to us. They had the sense that the humanitarian system tends to keep them somewhat at arm's length. In some ways, they have probably a better understanding of humanitarian behaviors than we do, including during times of crisis. And we got evidence that some of them are really thinking hard about how to adapt digital technology so it's appropriate to local conditions and cultures. So forging new partnerships with tech companies to further humanitarian reform and envision a better humanitarian system in the future shouldn't really be seen, I think, as the work of information management officers, but rather as chief executive officers. And that's something that I think we need to think about. And finally, I suppose, and this is the depressing bit, we need to implement what's already been agreed. I'm old. I've been 30 years of my professional life, plus 30 years of my professional life, actually nearly 40, which is rather frightening, working for the international humanitarian system. And for the last 3 of those years, I've actually been on the outside looking in. And for sure, while life-saving work continues to be done, and there's a massive effort to push change, some of what I see remains disturbing. We have this endless kind of unaccountable debates about stuff that so obviously needs to be fixed, that it's all written down in commitments, but quite simply has not yet been implemented. I think that's almost perfect timing. Takako, back to you. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for your wonderful presentation. So I couldn't agree more about the 6 issues at the beginning you raised. And I think these 6 issues we always are considering under the pandemic area. So I have a couple of questions. And you also mentioned the local leadership would be that's very important to look at for the future. Local leadership issue, we have been talking quite a long time for many, many years. And we all know it's very important to they address the importance of local leadership and also they increase their capacity. And what really do you think, what is the current status and how we can move forward to implement this? And do you have any good example to share with us?
It's a really good question, and it's a very interesting question. I mean, the sense that we have from the conversations that we had, and these, it was interesting that the people that we had in the room were an enormous spread at the symposium, right the way across from kind of local government officials, local NGOs, through to our colleagues from the UN agencies, and everyone was there. So it was a very interesting experience. And I think that the sense that I got was that across Asia, there is a move for national non-governmental organizations, local governments, and so on and so forth, to almost turn around and say, enough talk. We're getting on with this, and we're doing it. Really good examples coming from the National Disaster Management Agency of Indonesia, who were kind of scratching their heads. This was not related to COVID, but had been scratching their heads around how to make sure that lessons around disaster risk management were getting out to people in a country where there are literally hundreds of languages. They decided, they basically sat down with communities and said, what helps you to believe? Is it your phone? Is it television? Is it radio? And they said, oh, we really like puppet shows. So they worked on putting together a puppet show and showing that to people in local villages in the east part of Indonesia. And the take-up was tremendous. People were really interested because it resonated with their culture and their understanding. So what you're seeing is, I think, much more visibility around local leadership across the region. You're seeing some adaptation by international NGOs who are kind of nationalizing their presences. That's a really interesting one that we could probably talk about for a while, but also seeing the rise up of national NGO coalitions in countries like Thailand, in Indonesia, and so on and so forth. And I think as we look at the countries, particularly of Southeast Asia, slowly coming up the GDP rankings, we're seeing more resources being available to drive local action. And I think, certainly from my experience of working with OCHA for 10 years in the Asia Pacific region, there was a very large change in what governments wanted from us, what local communities wanted from us, which was not to come in and provide assistance, but to provide them with the know-how on how to do that. I go back to this point of kind of appropriate capacity building, appropriate capacity enhancement. So I think if there's going to be a relevance for international and, I have to say, regional humanitarian actors and intervention, it needs to be much less about doing stuff on the ground and much more about providing appropriate support to local organizations to do things, whilst at the same time listening to and understanding what capacities those local organizations have, and understanding far more clearly that they take the front line when it comes to building resilience around the appropriateness of culture and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. It's good to know to see there are some changes of the mindset of the government and international agencies who usually provide the assistance, not only giving the items, but rather they understand the need of the capacity building and empowerment. So thank you so much. Okay, so we have a question from the audience. Regarding the item number 6 in the last slide, implement what has already been agreed. Why are you keep using the word lessons learned? A textbook of disaster medicine recommends to stop using lessons learned because of its ambiguity.
It's a good question, and maybe we should talk about lessons observed and not yet learned. That would be my very brief. It's actually a really good point, and maybe that's something to think about in terms of how we actually entitle this document going into the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. Thank you. I will take that on board. I don't have an answer other than you're completely right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Oliver. All right. Okay, wait. Okay, so I have another question. You also addressed the importance of the partnership. And I'm sure the shape of the partnership, maybe it's changing also compared to the 10 years ago. Then I see the more importance of the role of academia as well. And you currently involved in some of the work of academia in Malaysia as well. So what do you think about the role of academia for future disaster risk reduction?
Well, I think the fact that we're having this conversation today is a really good indication that academia has a role to play. I mean, it brings up an interesting angle to this, which I didn't cover in my presentation, but that is looking out at future risks. What is coming down the tracks, trying to understand what's coming down the tracks that the humanitarian community is going to face and is probably relatively poorly tooled for. I'm doing some work also with the Sunway Center for Planetary Health. And there we're just starting to look at and think about a little bit, a different approach to humanitarian action that takes into account the relationship between the health of people and the health of the planet. Now that's a kind of new, larger paradigmatic view of where and how humanitarian action fits into the broader world. And I have the sense a little bit that the humanitarian system is a little bit stuck in its own kind of self-perpetuating cycle of not seeing itself as the center of things, but placing itself too centrally in the situation that humanity finds itself in. And I think there's some very interesting work that academia could be doing about looking at, what comes after the end of the Sendai framework. What's the next way in which we should be looking at this, and how do we start to bring together what Sendai is talking about, what the SDGs are talking about, what is the post-2030 agenda? Because I think, however we look at it, the post-2030 agenda has to take into account that we are going to be far more exposed to risk in that next 15 or 20 years than we have been in the last 50 or 100 years.
Thank you, Oliver. And also this year is a midterm review, because you addressed the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And this year is the midterm review of the Sendai framework of disaster risk reduction. So what is your personal view about the progress of Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction as a midterm?
Oh my gosh, that's an enormous question to ask.
I know.
What is my view? I think we're going to find that it's a little bit like the Sustainable Development Goals, that they've been whacked very hard by the pandemic. I think it's going to be the same for the Sendai framework priorities for action. But my fear is that we're also going to find that the political environment that we find ourselves in 2022, being so different from the political environment that we were in 2015, means that there may need to be a fairly significant adjustment in how we look at the second half, the implementation of the second half of the Sendai framework, recognizing the much more complicated geopolitical dynamics that there are out there, and the fact that the world's attention is simply, unfortunately, not clearly enough focused on the risk reduction agenda.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm sure that when the Sendai framework was developed, at the time we are more focusing on natural hazards. But now, and also the next 15 years, we also have to think about different risks like pandemic and technological and human-made hazards. So that's the big homework for all of us, I think. Yeah, so thank you so much, Oliver, and for your participation.
Thank you very much indeed.
Participation. Yeah, and I hope we can work together for the future, and our paths will be crossed again.
Would be a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Oliver.
Thank you, Takako, very much.
Thank you. Okay, so now it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Ms. Jessica Alexander, the second speaker, the policy editor of the New Humanitarian. And her career as a humanitarian aid professional has included experience in operations, evaluation, and policy with global deployments spanning in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, all over the world. She's two-time Fulbright grantee who received the award to research Japan's approach to disaster risk reduction in 2019 and the use of child soldiers in Sierra Leone in 2006. And she received a Master of Public Health and a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University. She teaches humanitarian affairs and accountability at numerous global universities. She has authored policy papers and mainstream articles about the humanitarian sector. And also, I have to highlight, is the author of Chasing Chaos and My Decade in and Out of Humanitarian Aid. So it's great to see you again, Jessica, and after a long time. And we took a joint research together, especially to Mabi City in West Japan in 2020. And we look forward to learning from your experience and your recent research. Floor is yours, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure and honor to be on this panel and to reconnect with some of my colleagues, like yourself, both in Japan, but also from OCHA, Oliver. So I now live in Geneva, and I'm speaking today from the perspective of the policy editor at the New Humanitarian. So my talk is really drawing on some of the work and the analysis that I've done there for some of the articles and the conversations that I've been privy to in that role, but also some of the work that I've done recently with UNDRR on looking at how the humanitarian sector has or has not been successful in integrating risk reduction reduction into its approach. And so I'll speak today about some of the persistent challenges that I've seen in doing so, but also some of the current and promising trends. And just to build on what Oliver said, which I fully agree with, and I write a lot about in the New Humanitarian, are these endless commitments that the humanitarian and development sector signs up to, which often, stay at that policy level, and when you go to the field level, you see that they're not fully implemented. And it's not just when it comes to DRR, but to many of the underlying structures around the humanitarian system, including around localization, which we just discussed. And I couldn't agree more with Oliver, your assessment of this thought around enough and thank you, but no thank you to the humanitarian system. And, our system tends to be quite, I guess, narcissistic in that, if it is not doing it, then the assumption is that no one is. And when I was at OCHA, we were talking less about whether we, being the international sector, are meeting the needs, but more about our needs being met, and if so, by whom, and that being a more relevant question. And that's an important distinction because there's capacity and action happening all the time outside of our, being the international humanitarian, ours myopic scope and vision, and an acknowledgement that we need to capture and be more aware of what else is going on. So going back to the initial question and the focus of my talk around integrating DRR into the humanitarian sector, as you all know, the humanitarians are responsive by nature, coming in to support communities and people after a disaster strikes. Historically, it's been part of the development remit to put protective and preventative measures in prior to emergency. But I think we're seeing a shift in both mentality, policy, and practice within the humanitarian space. And first, I'll talk about the policy landscape a bit broadly. And it's widely agreed that there's a need to better align development, humanitarian, and peace-building efforts to address root causes and avoid the protracted and recurrent nature of humanitarian crisis. And the importance of DRR specifically has risen across these global policy agendas. And I don't need to name them for this audience, but they range from the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement, the New Urban Agenda, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. And what's interesting from the humanitarian sector's perspective is that deliberate coherence has been built across these agendas to make them applicable in both humanitarian and development settings. And these are reinforced by the Secretary General's Prevention Agenda, which calls on all UN agencies, programs, funds to transcend these divides and to reduce long-term risks and vulnerabilities and to build more resilient societies. This is also reinforced, of course, in the Sendai framework, which promotes these linkages as well. But as Oliver said, these things look nice and here are spoken well in conference rooms, but in practice, they're not necessarily happening, and you don't necessarily see those being translated on the ground. And while DRR can be a bridge between these sectors, it still often falls in the gap between humanitarian and development assistance, with some elements that fall into each sphere. Or it's this hot potato issue with some humanitarians still arguing that risk reduction is mission creep and not part of the humanitarian mandate, but falls more squarely within the development realm. Humanitarians should stick to the business of saving lives and providing emergency aid. And the policy shifts that I mentioned encourage the dissolution of these distinctions, but both sides experience gaps in implementation. And the humanitarian sector in particular has been slow to adapt to the new realities that crises, including pandemics, require specific skills, approaches, and partnerships to deal with different kinds of risks. But as I mentioned, there is somewhat of a turning point now that we see today when it comes to anticipatory action and preventive investment. As climate change threatens ever more frequent, powerful, and overlapping disasters, some organizations have begun to shift approach, putting more resources up front. And this has been made more pressing because of the current financial situation of the humanitarian system. In 2022, the humanitarian ask broke new records. There was a $41 billion request to help 183 million people in need across 63 countries. And this is nearly double the amount that was requested just in 2019. And it was to assist more than 3 times the people targeted in 2015. So these crises and the rising costs come against the backdrop of flatlining funding. And many predict that the full effects of the economic contraction linked to COVID-19 have not even yet been felt. And Martin Griffiths, the UN Emergency Relief Chief, has acknowledged that the sector probably will not get to the $41 billion that's been requested. And that's not necessarily new. Humanitarian needs and requests have always outstripped what donors are willing or able to commit to. But usually that gap hovers around 40%. And in 2020, for the first time, the gap dipped below 50%. So half of the needs that were requested weren't met by humanitarian donors. So there's more urgency now among humanitarians to find ways to bring costs down. And one of those is to invest in risk reduction measures and apply anticipatory approaches. But it's not that straightforward, and there are many persistent challenges. But I'll talk first about some of the progress and steps in the right direction. So before Martin Griffiths was ERC, Mark Lowcock, who's the former ERC, one of his signature priorities was anticipatory action. And he saw that as a way to make humanitarian response better, faster, and cheaper. And the Central Emergency Relief Fund in 2020 invested $140 million to scale up anticipatory action in 12 countries. That was the first time that it had invested prior to crises happening. 6 more countries were added in 2021, and the programs consisted of forecast-based triggers embedded in clear decision-making processes, pre-agreed action plans to mitigate the impact of emergency, and the need for humanitarian relief and pre-arranged finance. And there have been other more subtle shifts pointing to increased attention and involvement by the humanitarian sector. There was a more visible humanitarian presence at the COP26 climate talks this year. And I think probably over at this point, but the last I checked, 200 organizations have signed, humanitarian organizations have signed a new climate charter aimed at addressing the climate crisis. And on the funding side, there are a few donors who are showing leadership in this area too. Germany has committed to providing 5% of its humanitarian funding through anticipatory approaches in the next 2 years. And a new Start Ready facility has made funds available to local actors from the moment a crisis is predicted. So it feels obvious that the system should shift to this more anticipatory approach. And it's encouraging to see that there is this kind of momentum around it. The benefits being somewhat obvious. If we know a disaster will strike, there's a moral imperative to act early. The cost efficiencies have been proven. The SURF did an analysis, for example, of its anticipatory distribution to flooding in Bangladesh in 2020 and found that it cost $10 less for each person supported than their more reactive response to a similar flooding in 2017. FAO has also done research which revealed that for every dollar invested in its anticipatory actions, affected households saw returns of up to 9 times as much in avoided losses and added benefits. So the benefits are really clear, making moral, financial, and logical sense to act early. But these approaches or the challenges for the humanitarian sector persist. It's still a very ambitious proposal and a completely different way of operating, and requires a real shift in mindset. And for some research that I did for UNDR last year, we looked at OCHA's coordinated humanitarian needs overviews and their corresponding humanitarian response plans in 12 countries. And while specific risks may have been identified in the humanitarian needs overviews, they were not always referenced in corresponding humanitarian response plans. And so it's unclear to the extent which humanitarians are actually addressing those risks with mitigation or prevention actions. They may acknowledge them, but they're not addressing them. Similarly, cluster activities mention words like mitigation, preparedness, or resilience, but specific actions to address those are unclear. And while the humanitarian needs overview is limited to the identification of hazards rather than a more robust analysis of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure. And this risk analysis is mainly single hazard focused without capturing sort of the interconnected aspects of risks associated with both conflict, natural, or other hazards. So these point to the fact that the humanitarian system is still at nascent stages of integrating risk and anticipatory action into its mindset and programming approaches. And part of the problem lies with the donor mentality. Research commissioned by the START Network found that despite at least half of all humanitarian crises being foreseeable and more than 20% highly predictable, less than 1% of humanitarian funding goes towards anticipatory action. Donors have been consistently reticent to invest in the what-ifs, especially when there are so many evident, urgent, current needs to address. And this no regrets mindset that accompanies anticipatory action has not permeated the space with governments, RCs, or humanitarian coordinators and UN agencies who are still discouraged by the financial risks of acting early, which is only going up given aid budgets tightening and more risk aversion. Governments have also been found to delay action to avoid what's considered wasting money on events that may never materialize. And to counter that perception that money may sit around or be wasted, some pioneers of anticipatory action have promoted the pooling of risks so that the same pot of money can be used for many different hazards, reducing the likelihood that it would ever go unused. And one way to boost donor funding that goes back to what humanitarians can do is to build the evidence base for DRR investments, for which there currently is a notable lack of evidence. Policymakers and governments still often fail to appreciate the economic value of disaster risk reduction. So documenting the cost and benefits of investing in risk and early action can foster a greater understanding and build more support for its investment. And while the policies I've talked about earlier linking humanitarian and development action, there's a consistent and perpetual siloing of humanitarian development and climate change adaptation activities. For the humanitarian and development sector, when it comes to DRR, this is partly because the two sectors don't always operate in the same geographical areas, with development actors tending not to invest in areas of high risk. The World Bank and the IMF, to their credit, have stepped up in this regard, but connecting all of the disparate parts of the puzzle continues to be a challenge. Similarly, most anticipatory action in DRR has taken place in countries that are easier to work in, and donors and agencies are only beginning to develop frameworks to act early and mitigate natural hazards in more fragile and conflict-affected settings. But it should be the opposite, as where conflict and climate events come together, the impact is particularly devastating. The two are mutually reinforcing, insecurity eroding resilience to disaster and potentially spurring more conflict, and countries experiencing violent conflict or fragile governments least likely to be able to respond to disasters and adapt to climate change. A recent study by ALNAP found that climate change is disproportionately likely to affect fragile conflict-affected states and to have a much greater impact on the population. The study found that this is partly because low-income conflict-affected states are highly reliant on agriculture, often severely disrupted by climate shocks and stresses, and conflict will have made people more vulnerable to crisis by increasing food insecurity, disrupting economic activity, and decreasing the government's ability to provide services. And yet, in settings of conflict or displacement, there are even bigger gaps in understanding and responding to natural hazards. And there are few tools to address DRR and many competing priorities and agendas. In those contexts, typically the main focus is around conflict-related needs. And responders may be aware of DRR, and I mean humanitarian responders, but they treat it as a different priority, or as I heard by some, a distraction to the real needs, which are those related to the conflict. And humanitarians may struggle to identify implementing partners to program DRR in those contexts due to a variety of factors, including under-resourced government counterparts. And more broadly, coordination in the space is also confusing and complex, with many actors, financing channels, and discourses. You have the climate change adaptation, DRR, peace building. It creates high transaction costs, duplication, lack of coherence, different entry points, and it saps limited capacity, particularly in terms of country-led coordination. So just in closing, I've described that people working in the humanitarian sector are aware of the work that needs to be done to further address risk and have made inroads, but they need to be scaled. And the challenges related to political will, funding, prioritization of work, and resource-stretched environment and leadership persist. But I want to end with an important recognition, one that I sort of started with. Humanitarians in country may not be aware of the full range of DRR activities taking place at national level, and they may not be coordinated across stakeholders. That includes the private sector, development actors, civil society, local government. There's a lot of work that's done on the local level all the time, every day, and this local level knowledge and practice has been recognized as critical assets in addressing risks. And especially in contexts with high capacity and willingness, meaningful DRR doesn't always require new systems or parallel processes brought in by the humanitarian sector. In many regions, including Asia Pacific, DRR is an ongoing process with stakeholders at all levels regularly developing resilience and mitigating risks. Humanitarians should and could benefit by building on these national and multilateral processes, capacities, and efforts, working through and learning from these already existing mechanisms at the local level. So I'll close with that, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me? Sorry, I have some technical problem. Okay, good. Okay, thank you so much, Jessica, sharing your view on the humanitarian and how DRR incorporated in the humanitarian and activities. So I think you raised and pointed out very important issues, and I was yes, a little bit still I remembered the discussion. The policy and the government still they are not really understood the effectiveness, cost effectiveness of disaster risk reduction compared to the spending more money to disaster response stage. So but academia and researchers working so hard to prove the effectiveness. So what do you think, how we should the contribute academia side to convince the government and also the policy makers more promote the importance and significance of disaster risk reduction as a government policy, as a part of the government policy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, there are all of these figures that float around about the cost savings brought on by DRR efforts, but few are localized. And so they're very broad. For every dollar spent, there's $7 savings, but they need to be contextualized to different countries and to really understand how those figures work in particular settings. Right now, the data is scant around that when it comes, and they're very different figures. I mean, when trying to pull this together, there was nothing, very reliable in terms of what that saving would be. But I do think that there are efforts now, and there's this Center for Excellence that's being put together by UNDRR and WMO that I'm going to be working with next month, for example, that tries to bridge some of the practitioners and the academics and others who are involved in the space to better understand where are their data gaps, where do we need more research, what are the advocacy messages that need to be identified and the evidence to back that up. And so I think there are, there's an acknowledgement certainly that there's this disconnect and efforts underway to bridge the two.
Yes, thank you so much. And also you mentioned about the conflict and the disaster risk reduction in the conflict situation. I think it's extremely difficult to convince these people, and we hear a lot of discussion. We totally understand the importance of DRR, but we have more priorities, the other issues to spend our budget for for the country. So to this kind of discussion, what would be your contribution?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult one, and I really have a lot of empathy for my colleagues who are working in conflict settings. They are stretched themselves. They are, stretched, in their jobs, just responding to the needs related to conflict, but also stretched financially and their budgets too. And so when you talk to them, it's like, people have said it's a distraction, natural hazards and thinking about those. But yet again, you see floods happening in conflict affected states. It's not like they are immune to natural hazards. And so I think one of the things is ensuring that DRR specialists who do exist in these places are brought into or, invited in a more proactive way into the humanitarian coordination space. There needs to be more guidance and support to already overstretched humanitarians who are trying to work and address conflict needs. And so finding those kind of entry points, because right now it's still very fragmented. And what I heard during some of the work that I did with UNDRR is, the coordination space is very limited to just humanitarians, and there's not really an opening for others to enter. It's already a very crowded space. But finding ways to ensure that those people are included, but also identifying too where national capacity does exist in those areas, because it does, and we tend to not to overlook that. And there were a couple of examples that I wrote about in a paper that I did for UNDRR, which were local engineer groups that if you just look outside a bit from the international perspective, who were doing assessments of bridges and bringing them into sort of the coordination for and having them inform the humanitarian sector was a huge asset to their work. So I think it's a bit of a mindset shift to not just think we only are responding to conflict related needs, but also there are many actors out here. We just need to look for them who are either already doing this work or with whom we can partner to enhance the work that we're doing related to DRR.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is not a question, but some comments from the audience. The mindset and actions of the government and the people towards disasters must be proactive and not just reactive, which are merely short-term. Long-term disaster resiliency must be given enough attention, especially in countries or areas which have high risk to disasters, either natural or man-made, I think, as you suggested. I think.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Right. Okay. I think as probably now you are you have the role of the journalist as well, and following a lot of current humanitarian assistance field in reality. So under this COVID-19 situation, we faced a lot of need of humanitarian assistance. However, a lot of countries faced a lot of difficulties to deliver that kind of necessary assistance. So for this kind of complicated situation, do you have any advice or future how do you call it how we can strengthen our humanitarian and also the disaster risk reduction actions to tackle these more compound and the complicated and multi hazards?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very broad question. And I think, what Oliver was saying too, is, and what, COVID also identified for the international humanitarian sector is, we're not the center of the universe. And, that we're actually a very small player in a much larger set of actors who are responding to not just humanitarian needs, but, development needs, socioeconomic issues, and pandemics. And so it's about identifying who those other actors are and where the humanitarian sector can add most value. And that may not mean that we are present in a lot of these contexts. And, again, this builds on what Oliver was saying, but recognizing, the enormous capacity in countries and helping, if needed, to amplify that so that they are resilient and can respond themselves, but also identifying where, it's needed to potentially plug gaps by the international sector. But it doesn't necessarily mean that this large, heavy bureaucratic machine needs to appear. And we didn't during the COVID pandemic. And yes, there were many challenges, but I think it sort of awakened everyone, or made everyone more alert to the fact that there's so much capacity in country. And, some of that does, can be augmented by the humanitarian system, but it doesn't always necessarily need to be. And as Oliver said, there's this sort of pushback, at least within Asia, in some countries, of enough. And I think we really saw that play out in the pandemic. So I would say showing more restraint, actually, and identifying where the humanitarian system can add the most value, while also, appreciating and highlighting all of the capacity and ongoing work that's already being done at a local level.
Yes, I actually totally agree. Maybe this opportunity gave us the opportunity to look into our own capacity and assess our own capacity. And how we should strengthen our current capacity to, to tackle the future risks, not really rely on the assistance from the international or regional levels.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So thank you so much, Jessica, for your participation. I understand there is still a very early morning, but I hope you can come back to Japan once again in the near future.
Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you. Okay, so now I'd like to invite our last speaker today, Dr. Miwa Hirono, an associate professor and also associate dean at Reimagining University. And until she joined Reimagining University in 2015, she held a Research Council's UK Research Fellowship and Deputy Directorship at the Institute of Asia and Pacific Studies at the University of Nottingham. Her publication includes China's evolving approach to peacekeeping and civilizing missions, international Christian agencies in China, and cultures of humanitarianism perspectives from the Asia Pacific. And she has taught at the Australian National University, where she was awarded a PhD in international relations, and also the University of Cambridge and the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. And she was a visiting fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Herbert Kennedy School in Fulbright Fellowship, at the Institute of Ethnology and Anthropology at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and at Beijing University as well. And she's conducting a research, especially focusing on disaster response at local level recently, and we look forward to learning from your research. So thank you for your participation, Professor Hirono, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your kind invitation for the webinar series. It's a great pleasure to see Dr. Takako Izumi and also see Oliver and Jessica, whom I really admire and had many conversations about international humanitarian assistance in the past. Now, I will be building up on their talk as they discuss the need to strengthen local leadership and the need to integrate risk reduction into humanitarian assistance. My talk relates to local leadership, and also it addresses both DRR and the humanitarian emergency context, but I will take a very different approach to these issues by bringing the local issues to the center of my analysis. So my presentation takes this localization agenda very seriously and gives attention to who local actors are, what capacity they already have, and how the existing local capacity can be utilized to save lives and mitigate disasters. I just kind of hear some noise, but is my internet okay?
Yes, and it's okay.
All right. Yeah, okay, sorry, thank you. Okay, so yes, I've been running a research project with my colleagues at Reimagining University, which is also joined by several colleagues from Harvard University and Australian National University, to explore this concept of local knowledge as local capacity. Let me give you a bit of a gist of this project. This project dates back to my conversation with NGO communities and international humanitarian communities about the importance of locally led approaches to disaster responses, as opposed to internationally led or nationally led approaches to disaster responses. When disasters hit us, the most immediate and effective response derives from your family, neighbors, or local communities in the disaster areas. While various international policy discourses such as Sendai Framework and Grand Bargain claims the importance of so-called localization of disaster responses, I felt that such a discourse has some problems. In a nutshell, the biggest problem I felt was that the policy discourse didn't take seriously the existing local asset, which is what I call local knowledge. Asia, for example, has thousands of years of histories and traditions of responding to disasters. During such a long history, Asia has accumulated very rich knowledge and experiences in disaster responses. The international discourse talks about various localization efforts. For example, local participation and how much funding should go to the local NGOs, how local actors can be part of the coordination of disaster responses, etc. But none of these policies, however, take seriously the existing local knowledge about how to address disasters and recognize it as the starting point of talking about local capacity building. So when we talk about local capacity building, the policy community tends to pay attention to the capacity of somewhat technical nature, such as rescue techniques, coordination, knowledge, accounting and auditing, monitoring and evaluation, planning and risk management, etc. But these are, of course, extremely important. But when we talk about local capacity, we should not forget that they have responded and managed local disasters for centuries. They have already developed their capacity, which is called local knowledge. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is twofold. First, I will quickly give some critiques of the policy discourse about localization and argue for the need for academic research on localization, in particular, the need to focus on local knowledge in disaster responses. And secondly, I will discuss how to conceptualize local knowledge and offer 4 types of manifestations of local knowledge that help to save lives in disasters. So let me move on to the first part of the talk, which is to argue why academic research on local knowledge matters. The most important and recurring comments I hear from the international policy community is that people all think localization is really important. But after having some conversations, I often realize that there's not much academic evidence that supports their argument. There are 4 reasons, as you can see. The first reason is that the policy community tends to make intuitive assumption that localization should work. But to make such a claim, there needs to have some serious investigation about when localization works and when localization doesn't work. When it comes to the distribution of limited resources across communities in desperate needs, for example, you need a central national agency that distributes the goods in a fair and equal manner. And if the local community has some corrupt leaders, localization may be detrimental. So we need some theories or systematic thinking about how and when localization works. And now the discussion is based on the intuitive assumption that localization should work. So academic research is needed to establish some systematic thinking. Second, and relatedly, assumptions are made based on some fragmented in-field experience. I highly respect practitioners who work in the field and have so much in-depth knowledge. However, the experience-based assumptions are often fragmented. Yet again, we need some systematic thinking about how and when localization works. Third, there are various interpretations of what localization actually means. Some take it as a problematic to call it as localization because it sounds as though disaster responses were originally international, national. Let's make it into, let's localize disaster responses. But the starting point is pretty different. The starting point of disaster response was local. So that's why I intentionally call it as locally led approaches rather than localization. But also the various people use the word localization in a very different way. So lots of different interpretations. And fourthly, and this is probably the most important thing to my project, is that there is less attention paid to non-institutional local actors based on cultures, histories, and traditions. So when the disaster hits us, it really is the non-institutional local actors that really matter. The families and also diaspora, ethnic communities or mothers groups. These non-institutional actors are the first port of call when disaster hits. And these actors are established based on cultures and histories and traditions. So when we talk about locally led approaches, it's extremely important to pay attention to these actors. So to address these problems, we need some systematic approach to locally led disaster responses, which are grounded in cultures, histories, and traditions that have developed over the centuries. In other words, we need to recognize that rich tradition and history in Asia as the backbone of disaster responses. And these are the indispensable capacity that local actors already have. But the problem is, or the difficult thing is, local knowledge is something that you cannot touch, or you cannot hear, or you cannot sort of, observe. This is a very conceptual issue, local knowledge. So how to recognize local knowledge is the first challenge. And that's why my research project actually offers an analytical framework as a tool to recognize local knowledge. So the aim is to recognize the local knowledge and start thinking about local capacity building from the local knowledge as the starting point, from the what they have already as a starting point. So that's what my research project is all about. So let me move on to the second part of my talk, which is the how to conceptualize local knowledge and how to think about this analytical framework. So what is local knowledge? So the way we are thinking about local knowledge is not static. Many people say, when I say local knowledge, many traditional, ancient, exotic, something that stays in a historical capsule, if you like. But we're not talking about local knowledge like that. The local knowledge is a very evolving process of tradition and modernity. No one today lives in a cocoon of tradition. The knowledge is evolving day by day, and it's evolving all the time. So the local knowledge we are talking about is a very evolving concept, dynamic concept. And what are the local knowledge that are evolving and dynamic? And we really need to start our discussion from that understanding. And the definition I found very useful is here. Local knowledge consists of factual knowledge, skills, and capabilities, most of which have some empirical grounding. It is culturally situated and is best understood as social product. So these bits that I put in red font are really important when we think about disaster responses. You need knowledge, skills, and capability, and these need to be understood in a cultural and social context. So let me just talk briefly about the analytical framework and how the local knowledge manifests. What does local knowledge look like in reality? Our research team put forward the 4 manifestations of local knowledge. As you can see, social capital, contextual historical memories, methods of adaptation through dialogue, and evolving customs, practices, and beliefs. So I've got the 3 more minutes. So let me briefly explain these concepts. So social capital. Social capital theory states that the social networks have some values. And social capital is similar to other forms of capital in that it improves productivity. But social capital does so through trust, norms, and networks, which grow from connections between individuals. Increased trust, cooperation, and mutual support within a community decreases social interaction costs, improves information sharing, and speed up recovery and enhance resilience. Specifically, there are 3 kinds of social capital. As you can see, bonding is the social capital within networks. Bridging is the social capital in between networks. And linking social capital is the link between an outside organizations and inside organizations. So these are very important, and these lead to an enhanced participation by local community in disaster responses. Let me just skip, for those of you who might be interested in this project, we will be publishing these resources, but I put some questions for local community and organizations to ask themselves about whether they have social capital that they can tap into as a local capacity. And so this is applied research. So I put some questions. I don't have time to explain all the questions, but for those of you who are interested, you can look up a project site and find these resources. I think these resources will be up in next week or so. So I will just focus on the conceptual side. This concept, contextual historical memories, basically I'm talking about the fact that when you do disaster responses, that has to be understood within the social context. And oftentimes this contextual historical memories really matter. Think about the time that you give, one gives humanitarian assistance to a particular ethnic community that has had a very bad historical memories against the majority. So if there are some historical animosity between the minority group and majority group, the humanitarians must understand that social context when you do some activities. So historical memories are local knowledge, and that's an extremely important place to start from when you talk about humanitarian assistance. The third one, this is the kind of methods of adaptation through dialogue. What kind of pattern of interaction do you have? The ways of interaction can lead to assimilation of a particular community to outside values and beliefs, or sometimes conflictual, or sometimes lead to new consciousness. By interacting with others, you can develop something new as a result of interaction with outsiders, or you can sometimes sharpen consciousness as a group. I'm afraid I don't have time to explain or give you some example for this, but recognizing this pattern of interaction is very important. When you have some interaction with outside groups. If the particular community tends to have conflict before intervening into that particular community. And finally, I'm sorry, I'm rushing this. Finally, the importance of customs, practices, and beliefs. Disasters are getting everyday activity now. Then disaster should be understood as a routine. Then customs, practices, and religions, an extremely important element in disaster responses. And this also helps us to understand the hierarchy within the community and also pay attention to those who fall below the hierarchy, those vulnerable groups such as women and minorities. Some case study that we have in the research group shows that the particular community who have good access to Islamic manuscript, as you can see on the screen, have a better result in disaster responses because of the teaching, Islamic teaching that sort of facilitated the disaster response. And so this particular case study actually compared the communities, two communities, one with a good access to manuscript, one without a good access to manuscript, and talk about the relationship between that religious knowledge and disaster response effectiveness. So sorry, I'm rushing a bit, but if you would like to know more about this project, I'd like you to look up our project's website. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Professor Hirono. It's very, very interesting research. And also, I think a lot of people felt it was very much eye-opener because we really use the term local knowledge and local capacity without thinking anything further, like you mentioned. So I just wanted to know a little bit more about your project. You mentioned you are conducting such research projects, conducting interview or some survey. And can I ask which area you are conducting this research, the major target countries or areas?
Okay, thank you very much. One of the setbacks, I must admit, is that this research project began as COVID began. So we all had this plan of doing field research, but we really couldn't. So what we did, we as in 8 or so core groups who are actually going to write a special issue in the journal, sort of looked at some data that have been already accumulated by individual research and sort of reanalyzed the data from locally led approach perspective, from the perspective of local knowledge. So that's what we have been doing. In terms of the country focus, we've been focusing on Japan, China, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And we are looking at a variety of local actors. So my case study is actually Chinese ethnic diaspora in Aceh, and how they actually had linking social capital with the PRC International Rescue Team. So that's my case study. Another case study is about, her case study is entitled Forgotten Crises. And this is something that it relates to one of the themes of today's talk, which is about the context of COVID. So when COVID happens, this is a new context, and this is the context that everyone focuses on, which is of course very important. But there are, as you said, there are compounding problems, and all the other problems that were significant before are forgotten. Gender crisis, conflict, and climate change, all those things are compounded. And now on top of that, we have COVID. So there are some forgotten crises, and how understanding local communities is really important to remind us of the complex sort of layers of the disasters happening at the same time. So that's one approach. So there are lots of different approaches. Someone is focusing on businesses and local government as the local actors. Also, others are focusing on faith-based organizations in Indonesia. Others also focusing on international center in Japan, acting as the center of hub for disaster responses for international students and foreign workers in Japan, etc. So yes, a variety of sorts of case studies.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I totally understand the challenges we are facing right now under the COVID-19. It's very difficult to move forward our research project. So you mentioned a couple of countries. So I understand that you plan to do some comparative study among these countries. So I'm sure you are still in the middle of the doing research, but is there any findings about comparison of these different countries? Is there any difference, specific difference in among these countries?
Yes, it is a kind of it's not a comparison in a systematic way, although the starting point of criticism of the international policy discourse was that there is a lack of systematic thinking. So we hope to get to the systematic thinking at the end. But at this stage of the research, we are still collecting some case studies and stories about how important the local knowledge is to disaster responses. So what we are doing is not quite a comparison in a systematic manner, but think about what emerges from all these different case studies and say something in common. And what we found is that those four manifestations I mentioned, are interlinked. So for a community to have good social capital, of course, relates to some religion and customs and practices that I was talking about, and also contextual historical memories. To understand the historical memories also relates to social capital, also relates to the way that particular community have a conflict against other communities. So these four elements are interlinked and overlapping. So we are trying to unpack this sort of relationship amongst these four manifestations at the moment. And this is going to be the final sort of conclusion that we are going to reach. But then the phase 2 needs to happen to make it more systematic in the future. So that's something to come. But that's where we are at the moment. We are still sort of collecting a lot of stories and case studies to say, to clarify how important local knowledge is to disaster responses.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. And also, I understand one of the goal is that to somehow include this point into the policy framework. So what would be your plan to include this kind of important issue into the policy?
Okay, thank you very much. So we are starting to draft this policy recommendation paper at the moment, but the most important thing is related to what I mentioned earlier, which is that the policy discourse doesn't pay much attention to non-institutional local actors, which actually matter. So disasters and ethnic communities, and these are really difficult and also, in a sense, open Pandora's box, because there are lots of emotion, sentiment, and problematic relationship which disaster response communities tend not to pay attention to, because that leads you to go into some political conflict and all those things. But then that also relates to complex emergencies, and this is something that we must address or recognize when talking about locally led approaches, because these things do exist. So recognition has to be there. So to come back to your question, one of the points we are trying to make in policy recommendation paper is to think more seriously about the importance of non-institutionalized local actors who actually matter to the people on the ground.
Thank you so much. So I think that's very, very important, the research and also the project. So I really look forward to hearing more about your research and also the results. And at the end, in the policy, what kind of policy framework was developed based on your research. So thank you so much, Professor Hirono, and all the best on your research, future research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Dr.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so that is all for today's session, and I'd like to extend our sincere appreciation to all the speakers for their excellent presentation and participation. And also our appreciation goes to the audience who joined us today, and I hope you enjoyed the sessions and learned from the excellent presentations given today. So please be informed that the recording and the slides will be shared on the APRU website. And also, I'm happy to share with you that the next webinar will be 15th and 25th of March, and which will focus on the recovery from the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami happened in 2011 in Japan. So we will have speakers, some of the speakers from Iridis Tohoku University, and they will share their experience and research based on this Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. So I do hope you will join us again and in the next webinar series. So for organizing this webinar, my colleagues at the APRU Secretariat in Hong Kong and also this Iridis help a lot and they work very hard to materialize this. So I thank you again for your significant support and contribution. And I look forward to meeting all of you again at the next webinar in March, and we will share the information in due course. And once again, thank you so much for the speakers, Oliver and Jessica and Professor Hirono. We really enjoyed your presentation and talk. And I really look forward to working with you again. And thank you so much. Then have a great day and have a good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Hope to see you soon.
Yes.
Thank you.